Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bradley Poku-Amankwa. I'm the Special Aide to the Minister for Energy in Ghana, as well as the Secretary to the National Energy Transition Committee. And today, I'll be moderating this panel on inclusive public-private sector partnerships. Let me just give a brief introduction of my fellow guests, my panelists. First of all, we have Mr. Kola Karim. He's the CEO of Shoreline Energy. We also have Nyimpindi Mabunda, who is the CEO of GE, General Electric Southern Africa, as well as Ambassador Professor Muhammadu Ka, who's the Ambassador of the Republic of Gambia to the Swiss Confederation. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
This session will be discussing how well prepared African governments and the private sector are to tap into the economic growth opportunities associated with achieving net zero targets. The session will address the hard questions of whether, as a continent, we are meeting the expectations of our future populations. We'll look into highlight opportunities that currently exist, which can be used to engage the private sector to contribute more meaningfully to a sustainable path to prosperity, and how governments can help along this journey. So before we dive in, what I'll do is I'll ask each of you what your thoughts are on the role of government versus private sector, just in 2 minutes each. Mr. Karim?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I think there is never going to be an opportunity where government could stand alone. Private sector's got to participate because governments just will not have enough money to fund all the gaps that's required in any society. So the play between government and private sector has got to be an interwoven one to have any structured, proper society that will be functional to serve its people.
Thank you, Mr. Karim. Nyimpindi?
Yeah, I think just to add to that, firstly, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here. Just to add to that, beyond money, it's also skill. I think government and private sector have, to some extent, complementary skills. But we do have a skill deficit in our continent. And if you look at the level of debt, in particular in the last few years, across many different, you just have to look at the debt to GDP ratio. It's very clear that the infrastructure that's required for electrification, for just transition, for agriculture, or to take opportunities that the globe present will require more money than the balance sheet of the government. And therefore, that collaboration is very important. But the role of government, specifically to your question, is creating the environment from a regulatory point of view to make sure that the investment climate is attractive, because globally there's competition for money. You know, investors have got choices of where to take the money. And secondly, create incentives, you know, and to really make it worthwhile for people to bring the money here.
Thank you, Nyimpindi. Ambassador?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. And I must say, congratulations to all the women here for the International Women's Day. To answer the question that you've raised, I agree with my colleagues here. The central role of government.
Siri doesn't agree.
She doesn't.
I disagree with Siri. For private-public partnership to achieve the path towards sustainability, government is central, because government have to create the right ecosystem and build it and govern it and lead it, and also provide the smart rules around the ecosystem so that private sector can thrive. Without it, government will fail, as I'm sure as we go through the exchanges today, most of our governments in Africa fail to truly nurture and have private sector root and lead, and they create the environment. So if I must say, the role of government is to change the mindset and create the innovative processes to build the building blocks of an ecosystem that will allow thriving private sector with the right mechanisms in place so that they can scale and they can grow and they can impact everyone, not just a few.
Thank you, Ambassador. The next question is building up of that, and I think that will go to you, Mr. Karim. What reforms do you think are required within both public and private sectors to encourage a just energy transition in Africa? And of course, given the fact that you're CEO of Shoreline, I'm sure this is it touches right at home.
It's a very touchy one when it comes to Africa, and I might sound a bit controversial. It's because the focus of our business is in the energy space, and that's oil and gas production. We come from a country, then I'll talk about the continent. Nigeria, as a country, has 212 TCF of discovered gas resources, and the utilization of that is next to nowhere. Yes, the global mantra about climate change is real. But the reality I always say about Africa is the importance of where we need to be as a people. If you look at the first world, they've gone through the first industrial revolution. They've gone through their second industrial revolution. The third is gone, and now they're focusing on the fourth. And we talk about a continent that's not even ridden on its first industrial revolution. And that, for me, is a bother. If we try to benchmark our continent on the same scale as the Western world, who's polluted for 150 years, then we're setting such a very high bar for the progress of our continent. I think it's got to be a two-pronged approach, and we cannot use the same measurements as we have in the West, but we understand and realize we've got to focus and take our environment serious. So what I see is we've got to work both. Because what do you do about the gas? If you think about the definition of climate friendly, gas was not part of it as of 3-4 years ago. But all of a sudden, the pain is hurting the Western nations, and gas is acceptable as a transition fuel. So I think as Africans, we need to start thinking holistically. What is good for us? What is good for our development and the stage of our development? And the stage and post of making that work is important. I think the world has gone through some amazing seismic shifts. The pandemic first, post-pandemic, has shown the frailties of human mindset. Then we talk about the industrial gaps as showing. But then Russia and Ukraine is actually showing the void of Western nations and sort of double standards of what comes. Because all of a sudden, because of the shocks of Russia and Ukraine, gas, LNG, is so needed in the Western nations, everyone's forgetting about this so-called dictum around environmental friendliness. So I think as Africans, our environment is very important, but I also think as Africans, we have to think holistically what is good to grow our economies at the same time and keep our people safe. So our governments have a lot to play. We need leaders on the continent who are decisive leaders thinking about our people first. We have to be selfish here. Because if we are not selfish as a people on the continent, we're going to fall short in the long term. Because what has just happened in Europe and it's happening today just shows how leadership has got to be selfish. Your people first. So as a people on the continent of Africa, we need to think about that. The other important thing that I see when we talk about climate change is Africa is a blessed continent because of the arable land we've got. I don't think there should be any gainsaying it's the shortage of food on the continent. Again, leadership plays a very huge role in where the differentials will come and how you focus your economy and how you drive it. African free trade has been a big mantra on the continent the last couple of years. But what is happening on the ground is there's a lot more business is being done by Africans, within Africa, and together. But the government has got to be in the fore. There's a practical example of what we're doing today. We're involved in a project which is building a rail line from Nigeria linking Niger, which is the country north of Nigeria. Now, this rail line is connecting the ports of Lagos to the interland countries without access to the sea. Now, what you need to understand is this. If you look at Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, all those landlocked countries, all their imports comes through western side of Africa. Majority of the shipments goes to the port of Cotonou and Lomé. I'll give you an example. If you're an importer in Maradi in Niger, if your container arrives in Lomé or Cotonou, it will take you 6 to 7 days by truck to get your goods there. Now, with the completion of this rail, from the port of Lagos to Maradi, 16 hours by rail, this tells you how Africa could transform. But it's got to be holistic. Leaders and leadership on the continent has got to be prepared to work together. Business and businesses on the continent has got to be prepared to work together, because the focus is we have people, we have opportunities, and we can scale.
Thank you so much, Mr. Karim.
Can I just add on that, if you don't
Absolutely,
mind?
yes.
I think we need to stop scoring own goals as Africa. Honestly, I'll just give you 2 examples. So South Africa, my home country, is one of the biggest exporters of right-hand motor vehicles. We've got a big, vibrant auto sector, like in X3 BMWs and Ford pickups, as well as Mercedes-Benz C-Class. 90% of that production is export, not for domestic use. Now, Europe, and it was said earlier, India, and all of these other markets are saying that 90% of what they buy will be EVs because of the legislation and changes and so on. Already today, we can't export that because we don't have capabilities to make EVs. EVs in South Africa are taxed higher than combustion engine vehicles. So the landing cost is expensive, including the parts. So now you have an industry employing 400,000 people that is under threat. We haven't changed the regulations. And EV didn't just land there. We've known about it for a long time. I can go on about examples in fintech of how the banking regulations haven't changed to actually enable the payment systems. Nigeria, if I'm not mistaken, only launched mobile money last year and approved such regulations. So if you're talking about unicorns, you're talking about opportunities in agri-tech, for example, for exporting. Our government is not always, our governments in Africa are not always enabling. And I think part of that, to be fair, is who is in those governments in terms of being strategic, in terms of understanding the macro environment and anticipating what's going to happen. So the one big reform I think we need to have in our continent is that of education and skill. We have a huge mismatch between our education system at primary and high school level to what the market needs. So everyone is talking about the fact that we would become the net exporter of talent because of our demographic, particularly with youth. It's true, but the skill that that talent has and what our education system is producing is not what the market wants. So we have markets today across Africa. I've worked in East Africa, West Africa, and Southern Africa, building data centers at a rate we've never seen before. They can't get data scientists. They can't get analysts. We've got a huge investment today happening in renewable energy. We don't have engineers, or even EVs. We don't have the engineers and technical people, even in digitalization. So hence the likes of Google would say they're going to train 1 million people in data science and all of that. But what are our governments doing from reforming our education system to have the outcomes that we want? Because if we don't do that, we're going to miss out on an opportunity that with our demographics and the cost of doing business in Africa, we have the opportunity to actually produce African solutions for the world, to the earlier panel. But you cannot do that without the requisite skills.
Thank you. Now, Ambassador, next question goes to you, and it is, how can public-private partnerships foster regional integration and trade in Africa, and what are the potential benefits and drawbacks? We're hoping that because of your diplomatic experience, you'll be able to take us through this quite easily.
Thank you so much. I think when it comes to setting Africa towards the path of sustainable prosperity, I don't think there's anything diplomatic about that. The crux of the matter is we are not prepared. And the first point of departure is to acknowledge that Africa is not prepared to set its countries and its population towards the path of prosperity. And our governments have a lot to do and a lot to answer. I may want to add that the key areas that are still a challenge towards that path is the governance architecture of our countries. The capacity, which my colleague have mentioned, the competencies that the private sectors need to scale, the competencies and capacity that our governments need to be efficient and to have the productive capacity doesn't exist, because the human capital that is needed to be sharpened, to be agile, to have the right attitude is missing because of a complete collapse of the education ecosystem and value chain. So until and unless we acknowledge that as a challenge, then to truly have our private sectors thrive and for our governments to make sure that our countries have the productive capacity will become a challenge. Financing and banking, to truly thrive and set the path, we need sustainable, innovative, impactful investments and capital. That means that the legislative frameworks that governs the finance architecture of our countries to make sure that the leakages are taken out, because corruption, it's a reality, it's a trap. The other is, do we have the required trust mechanisms? Do we have the clarity of vision and strategy to address these things? Without good governance, without institutions with integrity, without ethical leadership, we have a problem. And when it goes to the climate, I may add, and I didn't want to take provocations with my brother who talked about that he's anybody who doesn't want money, we have to look at you again. I think money is important. I think making profits are important, but at what cost? Is it inclusive enough? Is it broad enough? So that leads to the point that was made on trade. So the nexus of trade, environment, which has driven our countries to the imbalances of import and export, where we are not sustainable in the import and export dynamics. Yeah. So therefore, the nexus of trade and environment as it was before, we live in a new geopolitics, new global economic order, and climate change is a reality. We cannot say we are not part of it, but to ensure that development is appended on the nexus of trade and environment, and extrapolated to development, to return development as part of this triangular nexus to truly solve the climate crisis and challenge. And development not in the way we used to look at development. The centrality of people and well-being is essential in terms of solving the climate, because food insecurity is a reality. I even will say that our biggest risk as a continent is our ability to have a grip between this triangular mix that is affecting our private sector and our government's inability to provide the requisite ethical leadership and competencies to engage meaningfully around the table on mitigation, on adaptation, on de-risking, on truly sustainable financing mechanism. I think it's a long answer to that, but it's a very complicated challenge that will make the path towards sustainable prosperity a mirage.
Can I
Yes.
say something? Look, thank you very much. I think you've hit it. But my emphasis anywhere on the continent of Africa is going to be leadership. If we have the right leaders on the continent, the focus on transparency and all those things we talk about will fall into place. If we have the wrong leaders, just like any business, you have the wrong managers, the wrong CEOs, the wrong supervisors, there's failure beckoning. And that's the same way we should look at the continent. So the reality is making a success of every shortage or shorts that we face on the continent is always going to start from show me your leader. Transparency will follow. Just think about it this way. If you have a leader who has a no-nonsense attitude to corruption, do you think the followers would do the same? It will change. But if you have leaders who condone it or look away from it, it will be business as usual. So for me, transparency, legal framework, enhancing the capacity around legal framework on the continent is very important because capital, strange enough, is looking for returns. But if you are the managers of money, you want minimum problems in safeguarding your capital. So when you look at the spread map of the world, you're thinking as a money manager, where do I put my money and I am not at risk? And that's what leadership needs to address in being that attractive business or center to global capital.
If I may just add to that, because this is a conversation,
Yes.
right? I think I like the point on leadership, but I think we also need to get practical as to what is the challenge with leadership in Africa, as I see it. Now, we like putting the likes of Singapore and Dubai as poster child of how to do long-term planning for a country and how to really drive change. Because I think one of the briefing notes said, what are the steps we need to take today to build long-term prosperity? A challenge I find, and I've looked at some of the long-range plans for many countries because I've lived across the continent, is that we don't really have a true 30-year plan or long-term plan for the country. And even where you have those plans, even within the same party, when the president changed, the plan changes. and it's worse when the president changed and it's now a different a party, and then the politicians. So there's lack of continuity because there's just no narrative that takes into the long term. You cannot change a lot of the challenges we have today in our continent on a 4-year or 5-year term.
Yeah.
Not even on 2 terms. So what is that long-term plan that will transcend the politicians? And this challenge is also there in the private sector, by the way. And the way it comes across in the private sector in Africa is because a lot of the multinationals and even local big companies have relied on foreign talent to come and run it. We have, on a per capita or per basis of many businesses in Africa, a lot of expatriates leading our businesses. And an expat contract is 3 to 4 years. And I'm looking for my next promotion. And then I leave. And one of the big challenges we've been having is that for all these years that many of these businesses have had a presence in Africa, where is the local talent? Where is the localization? Because there's a difference between what you have now, even at a company like an MTN, that in Ghana, where it has got a Ghanaian who's a CEO of MTN, and it's a multinational. In Nigeria, it's got a Nigerian is a CEO. You have long-term interest of the country at heart. It's not just a job. And I think when you look at other countries, you have a lot more balance between the expert and the local. And how do we then get the experts to also be measured on some of the sustainability goals for the action that they take in the country? Because the real thing is, and why I pick on this, is that unless you have talent on top, who are then going to invest in developing younger talent and invest and take investment decisions that help grow that economy, you're always going to have an issue of extraction. So how do we create that balance from both a public sector and a private sector to have the right leadership that has a long-term mindset, to know that the benefits of the work I do today will transcend my lifespan?
I think Ambassador wants to.
I just want to add to that. I mean, and to anchor the leadership question. I will submit that we tend to simplify leadership. And leadership is not only government leadership, private sector, community, and across the board.
Yeah.
So the importance of African leadership and ownership, because leadership without ownership is a challenge. So African leadership and ownership is critical for sustainable development that will lead us towards the path of prosperity. The other point is inclusive leadership, where the gender question is central to the comprehensive rethinking of what leadership means in Africa. Leadership cannot continue to be loop-sided to a man-dominated leadership in our continent. Some countries are making strides. I'm not saying this just for the sake of it, but it's the reality. It is the truth. Until and unless we fix the loop-sidedness of the power and authority dynamics within leadership in our continent, we will not solve the leadership problem, whether it is private or public or community. Our leadership are falling short, this is the reality, of the climate and sustainability agenda for the continent. We have to accept that this is failing. We have yet to ensure a UN climate compensatory budget to which industrialized countries should pay for the continued pollution and destruction of the climate, that we bear the burden. Yeah. And it cannot be reduced to advocacy or to only civil society's interest. It should be our collective interest. And it is a benefit and a non-zero-sum game for the world if we do that. I will also submit that African leadership, which you've mentioned, on the long-term view, I believe that African leadership must take a long-term view that looks beyond short-term gains and focus on building sustainable and resilient economies that can withstand uncertainties and changing geopolitics and global order. This requires investment in human capital, truly and not cosmetically, infrastructure and not traditional means of investment, investing in infrastructure. Investing in digital and data infrastructure and solving the connectivity challenges of our continent is a prerequisite for smarting, leapfrogging industrialization to shift the dynamics of the imbalance of our country's over-dependence of exports and skewed negatively on import when we have everything in the continent. How do we shift the narrative of this leadership responsibility to build a production capacity as opposed to just increasing consumerism?
Thank you. The next question also dovetails from what we're speaking about at the moment, which is leadership. We often hear the concept of value for money, especially where public-private partnerships are concerned. And one benchmark of a good public-private partnership seems to be value for money. You hear many examples of presidents or ministers who are vetted on how much they spend on a particular project. Now, Mr. Karim, what would you say each sector, what role does each sector have to play in ensuring value for money in PPPs?
Look, I'm going to throw something, and as we were speaking, I just thought about it, and before I go to that, I think as a people, we need to try to rethink the type of politics or political gambits we play in our countries. I think one of the biggest problems of this continent is the politics played is winner takes all. So a political party wins, the term is 4 years, their plan is 4 years, even though the government before launched Vision 2070.
Yeah.
And it's a serious problem, because if you're going to have continuity to deliver value to our people, we've got to have focus on what type of government we're going to run. You see, sometimes you look at the definition of democracy, and we think it's so simple: for the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Is it really in Africa? I need you to ask yourselves, because it's each time at most of these conferences, you see, Africa's got an opportunity today. We have a very young population on the continent, very focused, driven. I'm sure everyone's seen what's happening in Nigeria. Political activism, everyone's awake. It's amazing. But the reality is, this government's only done 8 years. Then the next one, where is that continuity? Then it's going to bring it to plug onto this question, value for money. I think education, going back to what you said, is very important. You see, I've always been the advocate in the infrastructure business. You know, if you go back 20 years, you've got the Western nations on one side, and you've got China on the other side, and China is bad for Africa, and the West are bad, and there's this competition. But this is my take. If we educate and train our people who are meant to represent us in every bucket of society or government, be it private or public sector, then it is mandatory to deliver value in anything you're doing. See, it's only in Africa, is it value for money? We saw a bit of the lapses during the pandemic, even in Western countries, without saying much. But it's not tied to Africa alone, but the problem is we need to have well-educated, trained people providing services that will deliver to everyone and making sure it's value-orientated. Be you from the government side, on the regulatory and the policy side, be you on the private side, be you on the banking side and the financing side. Everyone's got to win. The failings that I've come across on the continent, I want to win, I want you to lose. It cannot work like that. If we come to the table with clean hands and we want to do this to make it work, that we all win, then it's to the benefit of all.
Thank you. I think for me, if I may just add two things. I think the question of value, we need skilled people to really assess and calculate and project, because you need to look at a lifetime value. Value for money does not equal cheap, and cheap can be a big problem. South Africa today is sitting on locomotives that it bought for $5 billion, and they've operated for 3 years. Half the stock is not working because they can't access spare parts. There are no technicians to measure that. Now, is it still value for money? So maintenance programs. I mean, we're talking earlier about the big challenge South Africa is having on load shedding, where 6 to 10 hours a day, an average South African home and business does not have power. Part of that is that maintenance contracts were not taken during the purchase of this infrastructure. Now, when you talk about infrastructure, you're talking about 20, 30 years. Now, if you're not going to know how you're going to keep it running, that's a problem, because what you pay is wasted. And right now, to correct that, the government will have to pay a lot more money. So I think sometimes there's been short-termism, and I'm seeing this in markets like Zambia, in Uganda, where there was desperation because the balance sheet does not work, and you said, I'll take something under the guise of a PPP, and someone come and build a road, and when it becomes broken, they can't fix it. And actually, to fix an issue like that costs you more money than it would have cost you if you've taken something that at face value looks like it's 20% more expensive. So we need to really balance between quality, usage, maintenance, and so on, and look at the lifespan and long-term project. The second thing is, a lot of the businesses that do large infrastructure are also global businesses. We need to insist that they work with local players, they localize, and then they build local skills going forward. But them being multinationals means that they've got benchmarks. So how do you explain when I know that a kilometer or a mile of a road should cost 100, and then when you build it in Africa, they say it's 500? And I know that a megawatt of power, it's so much dollars. And in Africa, then, sometimes you get asked and said, you come and say, I'll do it, it's 200. They said, no, make it 600. Because there's got to be reward along the value chain. And the issue of corruption is not an Africa-only problem.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of narrative around obviously Africa being corrupt. And I don't think we need to go there and paint ourselves that way, because there's a lot of good governance and transparency happening and some good stories around that. But we need to also admit that there are pockets of very embarrassing stories, which unfortunately the media amplifies, and it takes away the perception around value, but also on the how we do things. So the earlier point that Prof raised around ethical leadership and good governance and transparency is something that, especially as we're looking for private sector participation, as well as global funding to unlock that, you cannot run away from what we require from a governance point of view.
I'll throw in something that I need you all to help figure out, because in our separate countries, I think this is one missing link that bothers me. There's a particular country we're working in, a loan for 500 million for an infrastructure that's critical. The government is borrowing this money, and this government, the finance ministry, and here's the works ministry, the finance ministry insists on charging VAT to this guy who's borrowing the money. And I'm trying to explain to them, listen, you're actually taking 5% from money that you're borrowing, and you're paying interest for 15 years. It makes no sense. But believe you me, they insisted on collecting their 5% because it's going to the pockets of the revenue here, and someone's forgetting to link it that we're paying interest for 15 years. It bothered me. But after a month of trying to fight this, and the finance ministry officials insist that's the way we've always done it, and that's the way it's going to be, I give up. Right? For me, I need us to think about this. For every 5% VAT, for every withholding tax, another 5%, that's 10% of every project that government is borrowing money, they're actually collecting and paying interest on. Yeah. So necessary. So let's go for net. My position, borrow what you need. Don't borrow to finance an arm of government to pay heavily later. And every 10%er you see on major projects on the continent, you find that's what's happening. From duties, it's actually more than that. VAT, duties, and all this on these projects, government collects it. And yet they have to repay the loans.
Thank you. Can we just wrap up as we're running out of time? But as we leave, thank you so much for your time. I want you to all just give us an example. We've spoken about some of the limitations, but if we can all give an example from our specific countries of where a PPP has worked fantastically, in your opinion, that would be nice to end on a bright note as we have 4 minutes. It'll be 1 minute each, please.
I think we'll start with Professor.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether there is specific examples I can give you, but I can give you countries that where it is working reasonably. When I think of my country, the Gambia, it is embedded within the Ministry of Finance, Department for PPP. And the troubled energy sector, through a PPP partnership, it is able to make energy access much more sustainable. Now, the sustainability in a short term. The real sustainability is how to ensure that PPP is homegrown and the investments are from within and not by debt, because you have the debt trap that our countries continue, and some of African countries although there were gains on PPP, but the debt trap caught up with them to a point where they're in trouble. And some of Ghana is struggling. I'm not sure whether we have some Ghanaians here.
I'm here.
Here, so you know exactly where I'm going with that. And so the successes of PPP that is seemingly doing well in the short term, but as time goes on, the debt trap comes into being, I don't see that as a success. So I find it realistically to find true PPP that have taken root and help our countries towards the path of sustainability, which connects to the question of the value for money. Is there true value for money when we are debt trapped, when there are corruption leakages across the country, when Africa's wealth is squandered, when our imports continue to rise, because that's where we put money? Is that value for money? When our exports to get market access is very limited, when we are not investing in agriculture, when we have abundance of resources, when the extractive industry, we cannot convert them, when we cannot invest for value for money for small and medium-sized businesses that are being innovative, when to the point that you were making, when our processes are archaic and continue to be the same since colonial times, when are we going to disrupt and innovate processes enabled by investing on digital transformation and data infrastructure to motivate evidence-based policy to open up the space so that true value for money can be sustainable, broad-based, impactful, and improve the quality of lives of our population beyond a few, beyond the urban area, but ensure that the rural majority are brought into the fold to benefit from this value for money. So it's a long answer, but for me, I haven't seen true, sustainable, private, public partnership that we can celebrate because they are there in the short term and not sustainable. So the governance architecture has to be in place, integrity has to be in place, transparency has to be in place, and we must embrace emerging technologies. We must embrace digital transformation. We must build data infrastructure in our countries. We must ensure that the education ecosystem is not just a lip service to transform it, but to be adaptive and contextualized so that it's not only certification that goes on, but the mindset of our young and emerging is put into competitiveness and attitudes to be able to be disciplined to help the private sector and the public sector to thrive.
Thank you.
At the risk of...
Yeah, we've run over our time, so we'll just make it 1 minute straight.
Yeah, sure. So, Prof, at the risk of sounding like a self-praise, if you haven't seen a sustainable PPP, I invite you to go to Kenya and visit. There is one PPP that we're celebrating globally as GE, the company I work with, of what we've done in Kenya in the healthcare sector, working with the public sector. We've equipped over 120 clinics, and it's well known, really working with the government, visionary president at the time of President Kenyatta. And I think maybe because he came from a private sector as well, but we did this deal. We brought in developmental funders with the World Bank, Africa Development Bank, to make sure that it's affordable to the country, but we also brought in other institutions, US, because we are part of that. And we really did this deal, which is so exemplary. And it has helped save many, many lives because it's equipped in rural environment where people had to travel lots of kilometers to access healthcare, can now access it in their neighborhood. We're presenting that everywhere, and it's one of the showcases from the World Bank. And those who have visited South Africa in the last 10 years, thank you, in the last 10 years also would have also seen that you can now travel from the airport to anywhere by train, called Gautrain. And it's so world class. That is South Africa's best PPP. It wasn't funded by a cent from the government. They gave concession, they assisted with the lane, they did all of the taxation and also helped guarantee the funders and revenue for a long term. But that Gautrain is one of the best examples. The problem for me with both is how do we make it replicable and scalable?
Yeah.
And scalable. That is what we need to do better as Africa. To look at these success stories, talk about them, but say, codify it. What is the formula? So that we can repeat it not only within South Africa, but across the continent, in the spirit of Africa, continental
Absolutely.
free trade zone and building our continent.
And I think for me that's the challenge I have. That you can, Africa is how many states?
Yeah.
And we can only count a few.
Yeah.
For me, that is a challenge. Because it ought not be the narrative.
There's a common theme across the continent that we always overlook when we look at pockets of capital. That is our local pension market.
Yeah.
And that is a serious capital mobilization point that could interface well with a successful PPP that will enable delivery of most of these projects.
Yeah.
And the true value of all this is, yes, our environment is very important. Yes, the politics we play and practice on the continent is very important. Governance, dedicated leaders in both private and public sector is very important. But the most important people is us, the people of this continent. We deserve better, we want better, and we will get better. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.